everyone. We're going to get started. Good evening and welcome to the Jewish Museum. My name is Jenna Weiss, and I'm the manager of public programs here. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's program, Dialogue and Discourse, Dakota Jackson and Alexander Gorlin. Tonight's event is held in conjunction with the exhibition Pierre Chareau, Modern Architecture and Design, on view in our first floor galleries through March 26th. The final program related to this exhibition will take place next Thursday, March 9th at 6:30 p.m., when curator Esther DaCosta-Meyer will speak about Chareau's Franco-Jewish Cultural Circle. For full details about all of our upcoming public programs, please visit our website to sign up for our e-news. Now to introduce our speakers for this evening. Dakota Jackson has been one of the leading figures in American furniture design for over 4 decades. Since the early 70s, when he emerged as a major contributor to the art furniture movement, each of his seminal designs combines exquisite craft, intriguing engineering, and original form. Noteworthy among his designs is the library chair, first developed for the San Francisco Public Library and currently in use in libraries across the country. Another body of work includes Dakota's many collaborations with Steinway & Sons, producing several limited edition pianos. Dakota's furniture can be found in collections of the world's leading museums, including the Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum, the Museum of Art and Design, the Brooklyn Museum, the Chicago Athenaeum, and the London Design Museum. Alexander Gorlin is a noted architect, urban planner, design critic, and author. His internationally recognized firm, Alexander Gorlin Architects, specializes in a wide range of design programs that span the economic and cultural spectrum, including religious institutions, schools, high-end residential, affordable and supportive housing for the homeless, as well as master planning. Established in 1987, the firm has received many awards and has been exhibited widely. Gorlin has taught at the Yale School of Architecture and was a Rome Prize Fellow at the American Academy in Rome. He is the author of 5 books, including 2 on contemporary American townhouses, and most recently on Kabbalah in Art and Architecture, which won the National Jewish Book Award in 2013. Now, please take a moment to silence your cell phones and join me in welcoming Dakota Jackson and Alexander Gorlin.
It's, to say it's a great pleasure to be here, it truly is. To be asked to speak on Pierre Chareau is a terrific pleasure because of the place that he's had in my life. And if I may, excuse me. I can't, let me just make sure this does what I want it to do. I can't necessarily speak for Alex, but I'll take a chance that we live in a very visual world where, certainly for myself, perhaps for Alex as well, where a single line or an intersection of 2 lines carries with it extraordinary meaning. And it's that so highly considered intersection or a series of planes carried out in some field, in some fashion, which is the center of my life. It's my raison d'etre. It's what captures my thinking. It's what captures my emotions. It's what drives me, what creates a desire to create. The word passion is one that I'm not particularly interested in. Chuck Close said passion is for amateurs. And what he meant is that professionals get up every day and they just work. And somewhere in there, there's moments of being enraptured, of feeling, periods of exaltation, but there's also just the fact that there's work and endless work. And some of it's extremely satisfying, and some of it is we work because that's what we do. But again, for myself and probably for Alex as well, I mean, we happen to work in a field or in fields that are truly meaningful to us. So I replace passion with desire, and desire with execution, and execution with change. This piece by Pierre Chareau, roughly 1927, deeply changed me. In fact, to look at this, at the point that I saw it, somewhere in my mid-20s, just a few years before that, I was listening to the radio and I heard a song played by Alicia de la Roja, a Spanish pianist, and it was by, and at first I didn't know who it was by, and it was like, what? Like, what? I couldn't make out what it was, but it changed my way of hearing music. And so I had to wait through it, and of course I wouldn't pull myself away from the radio, and it turned out to be a piece by Federico Mompou, who I had never heard of, that was written in 1912 or 1913. And it was like a new type of music. And as I investigated him, now, you know, we didn't have the immediate ability to download, so you had to go to a record store, and it was a rare record store, and you had to find this album, and then within it are these pieces, these buried miniatures, this children's suite, Scenes d'Enfants, and it is a new way of hearing, a new way of playing. Mompou came from Spain, from Barcelona, but moved to Paris, and during those very, very formative and collaborative years, like what I would call the Big Bang Theory, he composed this music. And I eventually dedicated the next 45 years of my life, almost 50 years of my life, to Federico Mompou. Now, the same thing happened when I saw work by Chareau. And as I said before, I'm a visual person. I get stuck, I get caught, I dream about possibility. And at times I do intermix music with the visual. But what struck me here, and I don't know that I had the words at the time because I was in my mid-20s, but would be this connection between the cerebral and the romantic. And what do we mean by that? It's the formal and the spontaneous. The fact that there's a structure here, a supportive structure that's highly architectural, highly geometric, and yet it carries on top of it, so we have steel here, we have forged steel, and it carries on top of it this other shape where the only relenting element is that arc, and that arc has a certain sympathy for the body. But it doesn't go too far in that sympathy because it has to have its own integrity, it has to have its own structure, it has to have its own reason for being. And it can't bend to use as if, you know, the domestic object is only about the fact that somebody can flop back in it, as opposed to describing the way that somebody might live or want to live. But it did the same thing to me that Mompou music did. It was about the awkward moment, the moment between indecision and acceptance, that we can never completely rationalize, we can never completely we can never completely adopt something and resolve it. But what we can do is learn how to accept it. And this created an uproar, not just Pierre Chareau, but entire period of time. But for me, it fixed me. It's like, who is this guy? What's going on? This is what my life is going to be about. But if we go back just before that, and I don't want to really turn this into an art history, but I want to lay a foundation. So that was 1927. The Futurist Manifesto was 1907. The Czech Cubists were 1912. The Jugendstil was 1895 or so. I'm not an art historian, but there's movement, and there was a great deal of kickback in France to the Art Nouveau movement because they didn't feel it was about the French. They really felt it was about the Belgians or the Germans or the Japanese. But what Hector Guimard did, the same fellow who did the entrance to the Metro, he became a reductivist, and this was the beginning of a thought. He got rid of the flowers and the stems and the stalks. You might see a little bit of it here, and the leaves, and he just dealt with the stems and the stalks. But he also began to break away from the orthodox way of thinking about furniture in terms of symmetry, and he created asymmetry. He thought about this notion of work, the workstation. It was beginning to break with this idea of custom and beginning to really look at the way how we live, not just surrounded by decorative objects, but how we integrate. But still, breakthrough didn't occur. We can look at 1919 Eileen Gray. Exquisite piece. In fact, it's in the collection of Sidney and Francis Lewis. Sidney, unfortunately, is no longer alive, but he was a great patron of the arts. In fact, he did collect my work, and I'm forever grateful for that. This piece is in the Richmond Museum, and it's done by Eileen Gray in 1919, a major force, again, in design, and it is this chaise, and it is carved wood, and this is a patinaed lacquer finish. But it's interesting how in France it was a very slow period of evolvement, while if you looked at other countries, this movement into that point of backing out of a century and turning around and fully being in the 20th century hadn't really occurred yet. This was highly decorativist. Until, for me, again, another one of those moments of like, my goodness, this is it. This is the 20th century. Piece by Dunant, who was a lacquerist, and much of his work was so ornate, so highly ornate with flowers and leaves, and he worked in eggshell and very precious elements. Wonderful picture of him in his own studio. I don't have it here, but just evocative really of the 19th century, even the 18th century, all the woodworkers at that point. But what did Dunant do? This is just metal, a patinaed metal, where it's rough here, not too reflective, and then polished here. But he took a sphere, and to me, again, the awkward moment, he took a sphere, something that would roll, and he just went like that. And with that simple movement, it could no longer roll. It may even have had a certain gender element attached to it, this idea of something growing from inside, so that the forces are moving this way, but it could no longer roll. And then the brilliance was that the disc that's on top, and again, red and black, as you would see with the de Stijl and what was going on in the constructivist movement, that all of those other external elements, except coding, color coding for a piece, he took the disc and rather than centering it, he shifted it. And with that shift, there's a sense of movement, of direction. But it can't go anywhere because it's not going to roll. It's stuck in place. So there we have it again, the awkward moment, the moment between indecision and acceptance. And what we saw in the Chareau pieces, there's two materials. It's just one element that goes like this, and then the sweep. Here we have the sphere and the disc. And this idea of breaking the way we feel and the way we think to that notion of the cerebral and the romantic, the highly considered and the idiosyncratic. And then the other piece that shook me from 1927 by Pierre Chareau, a side table for a clubhouse just above Saint-Tropez in Paris, and it did it to me again. These two pieces, the one that I first showed you and this was during my formative time. I looked at it and it was like, here we go again. Here is a metal that is forged, it's not polished. It brings up this notion of what is a fine object, because it was beginning to shift. The 20th century was in place, the fine object was changing. And this now shifts, and it deals with function in a new way. Is it about function? Is it about the portrayal of function? Does it really work? How does it work? But the fact that it suggested movement. And the brilliance and the genius of Pierre Chareau, we can question in terms of where and exactly and how it came about, but was, as I learned to define him, it was about furniture, machinery, system, and style. And he was able to bring it together into one piece. So as someone who is very visual again, and someone who thinks about balance and imbalance, emotionally, internally, my imagination is no vacation, however you want to look at it, however you want to look at resolution, it was these pieces that it was like nothing I had ever seen before. It changed the way I wanted to think about working. We saw that again in Pierre Chareau. This is 1925, the International Exposition des Arts Décoratifs and Industriels Modernes in Paris. This was a major change because not only was this idea of collaboration, this was done with Jourdain and Mallet-Stevens and Chareau, and it was about the French embassy. And this idea of moving walls, this section that you can enclose, that it has this sense of change going on, change at any point, the notion of choreography of design. But what drew me in again was this desk. And just a movement back for a moment, this desk is owned by Primavera, and I was asked to restore this desk in 1975. So I know this desk inside and out. And this began another quest for me, because I started off as a furniture maker. And I began to restore, this being the first, I began to restore Émile Jacques Rouman for Anthony Di Lorenzo, who I believe is still on Park Avenue, Muriel Karasak, and the collection, the Art Deco collection of Ileana Sonnabend, the art dealer. In fact, I restored a bed, Max Ernst, 1925, and this is how I learned about furniture. I never worked with anybody else, but it was like just feeling it, being moved by it, being moved by this idea of the machine, sense of style. Now, he worked with two different groups. This is Dalbey in his forge, in his foundry in Paris, and you really have to say that Chareau was about collaboration. He started working with Dalbey in about 1923, but what's interesting here again is this notion of the fine object, that it was changing from ormolu and shagreen and lacquers and woods and patinas to just basic material, just stuff. And you can see it again in this easel that was commissioned by Émile Jacques Rouman for a home that he had done in 1925, holding the Chagall. And again, it's a piece of machinery, and yet it speaks of fineness, and yet it's always dealing with this pulsation between how do we live, how do we work, how do we engage? Is this a piece that welcomes us, or is it something that pulls us away? It's highly intellectual, and yet at the same time, one has to find a connection. One has to find a way to be with it. And again, you see it as he moves. He had two chief collaborators. One was Dalbey in metal, and the other is Eugene Prince, who became a designer in his own right several years later. But he's always looking at the idea of surprise, of function, furniture, machinery, this being the expertise of Eugene Prince, and this being the expertise of Dalbey. But the attention paid to locks and details, and again, this idea of how do we, the boudoir, and yet it's still so highly formal, but there's always that moment, there's always that click to the spontaneous moment. The idea of the drawing board and the fact that it can slide against the wall. These are machinery for living. He's not the only one who considered that. I'm sure that Alex will bring it up when he touches on Mies van der Rohe. But again, the desk becoming this element, it's like choreography. It engulfs you. It's always providing for change. We can adapt. Interestingly, his chairs were never really as exciting as his furniture. A piece by Eugene Prince, roughly the same time, whose studio the work was built in. But again, everybody was thinking about, or there were many designers at the time that were thinking about activation. And again, this is something that we do see in the Maison de Verre, but it was done starting about 1924 or 1925. Chareau opened his own shop in 1924, called La Boutique. And again, this piece being seen downstairs, how do we use it? How do we engage? How does the eye, how do we approach it? What is it? It's a constant relationship. It's constantly asking questions, coming back to it again. How do you use it? Do you really use it in this way, or does it find its own moment and then it stays that way and then it's static? Again, this for that clubhouse, and we see the patinaed metal, and it just means so much to me that as the world was moving towards this machine aesthetic, Chareau held back. He never fully became part of that world of industrial design, even though it was moving so rapidly that way. There could be emotional reasons for this, there could be other things, but it held him to it. But his sense of beauty and commitment was to working with materials that were not as expedient as this exquisite piece also by Eileen Gray, but very much about moving into the 30s and the world beyond in terms of the machine-made piece, the impersonal piece, a much simpler environment. Or what we see here with Le Corbusier, done in conjunction with Pierre Chareau and Charlotte Perriand, roughly the same time. So there you see the 20th century in full force, but when you go back to Chareau, you see something else. You see this kind of play between the worlds where he thinks about all of these kind of arcane elements, but that allows space to change by doing something called veiling and revealing, never concealing. And so space is relative in that way to what you can see beyond it. So that when you go to the Maison de Verre, you have the same thing in the entryway, where done again by Dalbey. In fact, Dalbey literally moved his foundry, not his foundry, but himself. He worked side by side with Ruhlmann to build this, and again, we go into this idea of collaboration. But the very fact that this slides and closes like that, and we have the perforated steel, it's not concealed. It's just veil, reveal. It's just, to me, such a beautiful notion. Again, these activated windows, and then this view down into the room itself, this absolutely exquisite room, this iconic space. Now, for me, comes from a different place. Jewish kid, father from a European family, a family of magicians. So that's Jack Mallon. And these were my heroes starting out as a child, and he trained me as a professional magician. And of course, Houdini was somebody that I could never stop thinking about. Harry Houdini, then came Harry Belafonte, but that's something else, and then James Randi, people who escape. This is all I could think about at that period of time, and there's my swan song to performing as a professional magician in, I think, about 1976, where for Interview magazine I performed bullet catching, and I survived it, and I never looked back. So, but now we come to our period, and like what was playing? If you say that the beginning of the 20th century was the Big Bang, this, in a way, was equally as Big Bang, and that was minimalism. And the work of Richard Serra, where metal, again, fineness about art was beginning. The question was that this was meant to be non-functional, not in the marketplace, not to be sold. These constructions, these very dangerous constructions, approach at your own risk. But again, we look at a metal, not unlike Chareau, no reference to Chareau, but of another time. But what was extraordinary about this work, One Ton Prop, again by Richard Serra, is the collaborative world that existed in the 60s into the 70s between the architects, dance, music, constant back and forth. The same thing that we saw in the 1920s. Part of what we're talking about is where is collaboration today? Another piece, Carl Andre. We play with the idea of now these things are highly sought after, but at the time that these were produced, it was in opposition to the market. That's where the avant-garde was at that point, and that's where I came of age. And these were the things that I was thinking about. Much more refined than Pierre Chareau in terms of the material, but very much thinking about the architectural, the architectonic, this idea as the designer of choreographer and movement. And as a magician, I had 5 tenets of illusion. One was, in fact, sometimes I forget it, so I wrote it down because there's almost too many of them. It's the illusion of spontaneity. It's the illusion of infinite possibility. It's the illusion of spontaneous transformation. It's the illusion of function, even. Does this function? Almost like those side tables of Chareau. I can't say which came first, whether I had seen Chareau or designed this, but they had to be around the same period. And the last illusion, and the most dangerous in magic, is the illusion of normalcy. I think we can also call that psychopathic, but I guess magicians have that in them. So a lot of my pieces revolved around this idea of minimum resistance machines, of new wonders of the world. Bell bottoms, that's probably 1975, but I started off as a furniture maker. That's all I wanted to do. After being a magician, I started when I was 20 years old, but I wanted to be something else. I wanted to be an industrialist. I was really worried about what happened to these very particular miniaturists who produced furniture in the 20s. What happened to those who came to this country? In fact, I'll end on a very strange point, but this is the development of my factory. A guy who started off working with his hands, but I wanted to be an industrialist, create jobs, create ideas, have studio, have factory, create a community within the factory, and then the kind of distribution network and enterprise that would go around it. But very early pieces for John Lennon and Yoko Ono had to do with magic. This came apart, it opened, it activated, it had a number of hidden compartments within it. Other things that I was thinking about were balance, precarious balance at that point in time, very elemental. We could go back and think perhaps Russian constructivists, but these things also grow out of its time. It grows out of what was going on in the art world at that point in terms of minimalism, but for me, it was far more refined than what minimalism spoke about. And then the magic box, which originally was designed for my wife Rosalie as a vanity, but somebody came into the factory and asked if it was a bar, and I said yes. And And it never became a vanity. And so my life at that point was making these one-off pieces, these desks, from Furniture as Deadly Weapons, the B-1 desk when Carter was trying to get the B-1 bill through Congress, based on the idea that, like the magician, the executive is involved with the portrayal of power, and he surrounds himself with accoutrements of power. But each element was machined. Each element was very specially handled, very specially manipulated, very specially fabricated, and again, within my factory. This was the well, we're into another moment in time here. Chairs. This is as I began to think about how do I approach the industry. And then there was the library chair that was mentioned. And this began to bring me into a highly industrialized world. I never left the hand, but I thought about the idea of an industrial consciousness that at some point in a process, the hand of the artisan re-enters it to personalize the piece. But of course, this was thinking about it in a different way. There were other parts of my factory which were involved in impeccable upholstery, thinking about it again, really about designing as a machine. There were a series of synagogues that I had been involved with, and this one may be due to you, the UAHC, the Union of American Hebrew. No, it wasn't that one. It was the other one. But the other one. But again, about movement, about opening, about, again, thinking the same way Chareau did, but here it's concealing and revealing. And then that very same idea in a synagogue that I designed, or the sanctuary, part of the sanctuary that I designed in Chicago for Temple Jeremiah, this idea of embracing. So we go from conceal to veil, and then as that comes back, reveal. Same thing took place in other types of work with light coming through it, thinking about Maison de Verre and wanting to approach it in a collaboration with the architect Peter Eisenman in LA on my LA showroom again. How do we mediate between furniture, architecture, and art? Again, the collaborative effort. And then moving into my Maison de Verre, an homage in 2000 to Pierre Chareau at one of the Kif Space show houses, where it's light. Day or night, it's illuminated. It's a room not to work in, it's a room to reflect in. It's a room that was meant to be shared between my wife Rosalie and I, in terms of Rosalie as an author and an historian and a curator, to view work, me to consider design. It's also a room for music, a highly personalized room. As Chareau, not as Chareau, but as Proust said, gathered about any given family were the instruments of its pleasures and the symbols of the period. So I wanted this room to speak about the artists that we were engaged with, our own thoughts, our own ideas, the books that we collected. One of my collaborators who worked with me for 12 years, I don't know if she's here, Nisi Berryman, we sat side by side, but when she went off on her own, this was one of her pieces there. Another designed by Michael Haverly Graves and Marissa, but a room full of art, the Pierre Chareau planter there. So truly an homage, a piece by Eugene Prince when he broke away from Chareau. And then just closing in on the end here, my life and involvement with pianos, the piano again as a machine. We see these different parts, these explorations, these developments, and this is done with my good collaborator here, Lucas Liebman. And it's a whole new world that we've been building, and just closing with where we are now, what we do today. Thank you.
That was very impressive, and I'm honored to follow Dakota, and we've worked together on actually his own house. We designed a dining room together that the entire ground floor. Yes, and the ground floor and the garden. So in a way, we're like a model of Chareau, except Chareau did both furniture and architecture, and I basically do architecture, and Dakota is one of the great masters of furniture design. I think I was most taken in terms of the relationship to Chareau by your images of the Ark, because in a way it reveals something I hadn't considered about him. Chareau's mother was Jewish, and although he considered himself Catholic And that didn't really, his colleagues all considered him Jewish, and that certainly he fled the Nazis in 1940 because certainly they would have considered him so. But the ark that conceals the Torah, in fact, is a movable piece of furniture. And the idea of something that is concealed that then is then revealed is so germane to all the kind of installations in the Maison de Verre that I think that's another Jewish connection, in addition to some that I will make, which I thought if we're at the Jewish Museum, I should point out a few of these unusual connections to Chareau. So I went to architecture school in the 1970s, and of all the masterpieces of residential design, the Maison de Verre was the most mysterious by far. Although it was considered at the same level as the Villa Savoy by Le Corbusier, or Falling Water by Frank Lloyd Wright, or the Farnsworth House by Mies van der Rohe, no one had been to the Chareau house because it was private, and very few people knew who Chareau was himself. So it remained a kind of oddity, although everyone pored over these photographs of the house to understand or to try to piece together the fragments that altogether made this holistic Gesamtkunstwerk, a real total work of art that Chareau accomplished. I visited it twice, the first time in 1980 after graduating school, and it was my first trip to Paris. And as an intrepid architect, I rang the bell to the outdoor courtyard, and they let me in. And I got up to the front door, and I rang the bell. There were 3 bells, one for the gynecologist, one for visitors, and one for service. I rang the first bell, and a woman came out and said, we're a private office, a gynecological office. So I said, well, my sister has a problem. And so I said, if I bring her tomorrow, would you let me accompany her to her appointment? And she said, yes, but you must bring her. So this was pre-internet, so I walked around Paris looking for my sister, but I was unable to take an ad out on Craigslist, so I never got back to the Chareau house until 25 years later, in 2010, it had been bought by Robert Rubin, who is a finance person who actually owns a golf course in the Hamptons, but is an architect connoisseur, and he bought the house, and he was gracious enough to allow me a private tour of the house that I had always wanted to see. And a number of things strike you about the Chareau house. One is that previously, it's mostly photographed as if it's a freestanding object. In fact, the house, the upper Ancien Régime Hotel Particulier is often airbrushed out or photoshopped out now. So I was shocked that, in fact, it's really an insertion under an existing building. And as you saw in the show, there was, in 1928, when the project started, the Dalsas family bought this old townhouse, and according to French rent control laws, and no one can be moved out of their apartments, so she refused, and they literally hollowed out the lower 2 floors and inserted this glass block in it. So I was fortunate enough to come in, and as Dakota showed, to glide past this marvelous perforated screen, and it rotates. In fact, the entire interior is filled with these machine-like objects that rotate, they swivel. Everything is on wheels, on axles, and this will come in later in terms of some of my observations. And then you ascend this floating stair, and you're immediately struck by the glass block, which is translucent, and you enter the Grand Salon. And another shocking thing is, I assume that these steel beams, these steel columns, were pre-existing and actually had been stripped from the original construction to reveal the nature. However, again, they were inserted to support the tenant on the upper floor, and this was, but it gives this strange impression constantly between what is old, what is new, and overall you feel like you're in a machine. You feel like in a Swiss watch of intricate parts. Now, Le Corbusier coined the phrase the machine for living in, specifically for his Villa Savoye, but compared to the Villa Savoye, this was the ultimate machine. In fact, Corbusier was seen secretly coming to the construction site, taking notes, and shortly after this was the Maison de Verre was completed, he really abandoned the machine style because he really, I feel, he couldn't compete with the intricacies of this project, in which everything was done on site. There were very few construction drawings. Chareau was on site with Dalbet to do the ironwork, to do the details, and it's very much like Gaudi, who was on the side of the Sagrada Familia to actually create in person as opposed to remotely in terms of drawings or instructions. So in this grand salon, you then also notice that there's no view out. Again, a very strange sensibility. You're really surrounded by this cataract of light, like you're in a cloud. And it recalls exactly Adolf Loos, who's an early 20th century German architect and Viennese architect and philosopher. He said that the cultivated man did not gaze out the window. He said his window is a ground glass, and he does not allow the gaze to go outside. And so, of course, Corbusier was entirely about the view out, the framed view, so he's perhaps less cultivated than Chareau and the d'Alsace family, who, this is really the sense of interiority, in the sense of, a real interior that's created even though there is an exterior to view. And it's so much different from, again, modernist concepts of inside-outside that Frank Lloyd Wright was about, or Mies van der Rohe. In fact, everyone was about the connection to the exterior. So this remains totally mysterious in that sense. And this is the opposite, Le Corbusier's diagrams of Rio de Janeiro, who shows how you create a view. This is the observer watching the bay and Sugarloaf Mountain. And again, the view does not occur until it's framed by geometry, by order, to objectify it and create, in a sense, and at the same time to flatten it into a surface. Now, I'd also like to, because I'm not talking about the entire house completely, but just a few observations that I don't think have been noted before. One is the connection of the Maison de Verre to a fairly, about a 10, 15-year movement in architecture and art that is the glass chain. It's part of German Expressionism in the 1914 to about 1920, and it was about, literally, one section of it was the elevation of glass to a very spiritual level. And in fact, the poet Paul Scheerbart wrote about glass, and he said, without a glass palace, life is a bore, is a burden, or colored glass destroys hatred. Glass brings us to a new era. We only feel sorry for brick culture. And the idea of glass was that it would open, it was a metaphor for opening society, to freeing the individual, and it was used very literally in a series of proposals for the city crown, or city centers that would be all glass and would glow with this kind of sense of freedom and the sense of the future. This is by Hans Scharoun, and it was embodied literally in Bruno Taut, who was an architect of this is 1914, the Glass Pavilion in Cologne, and it was very much, in fact, it's inscribed with sayings from Paul Scheerbart about the nature of glass and its spiritual value. And it was entirely constructed on the interior of glass block, and so the same sense of being in a translucent, glowing, shimmering cocoon of light is embodied in the Tout glass pavilion. And then finally you come up into the shrine of glass. It was also paid for by the glass manufacturing companies of Germany. So it was also to showcase glass, but at the same time embodied these principles of the spiritual nature of glass, which I believe carries forth into the Maison de Verre. And so this is a bit out on the limb, but I'm going to propose that another level of the Maison de Verre, the mystical level of its use of glass, not only relates to the glass chain, the crystal chain, which, by the way, the poems of Paul Scheerbart, one of the proponents of the glass chain, were admired by Gershom Scholem, who was the great scholar of the Kabbalah. And in fact, he took Scheerbart's papers to Jerusalem in 1923. So there is some connection between the two here. And inside, again, the sense of the wheel, the rotation of the machine is a repeated element. This is the wheel that opens up the ventilation for the great salon, because there are no windows, again. Not only can you not see out, but you cannot open anything. You are completely enclosed in this mysterious interior. And that circle motif, the wheel or the eye, the lens, is seen again in the flooring. This is the Pirelli rubber flooring that is all discs. And he uses that sense of the disc, the lens in the glass block. And this was made by Saint-Gobain. And then a closer view of that disc, the lens, the pupil, the eye. And so what Jewish object comes to mind when you think of the machine and the eye? Well, of course, it's the wheels within wheels of the vision of Ezekiel, the Merkavah. The Merkavah is the throne chariot. It's also the name of the Israeli tank, the Merkavah, to kind of share in its mystical quality. And so this is, the vision of Ezekiel is after the destruction of the temple, and Ezekiel in Babylon sees this out of this great storm, these wheels within wheels that support four creatures: the eagle, the lion, the ox, and the angel. And they support, these wheels support this a pavement of sapphire glass that supports the throne of God. So the idea of the throne chariot, the glass throne, and the wheels somehow, I think, connects to the Maison de Verre. But we don't stop there. In the Kabbalah, there is the concept of the vessel of light. And certainly this is a vessel of light. And the vessel of light occurs after the initial creation, where there is the tzimtzum, or the great void of darkness. And out of the void of darkness flows light, which flows into a series of vessels. But this divine light cannot be contained by the light, the divine light. And so the vessels of light shatter, which was the great tragedy of the universe. And it's called the breaking of the vessels. And this is actually exemplified by Anselm Kiefer's broken vessels, the Shevarat HaKelim, which in the end is a metaphor for Chareau's career. Because after the Maison de Verre came the Great Depression, and he had no work. And after that, in 1940, the Nazis. And so his career was shattered. He fled to the United States, and in the United States, he basically was penniless. He was supported by his wife and selling some paintings to the Museum of Modern Art, but believe me, Picasso's didn't go for the prices they do now in 1947. And Philip Johnson, the only one at the museum who could have helped him, of course, he was an old Nazi. He actually was on the Blitzkrieg to Poland in 1939, refused to give him a show in 1950 at the Museum of Modern Art. And he didn't connect him with anyone. He did do a house for Robert Motherwell, but Motherwell, again, was at the beginning of his career. And so in 1950, Chareau died. 5 years after he came to the United States, and he was forgotten for many, many years. Periodically, there was a revival, but in the end, after the breaking of the vessels, only the sparks remain, and it is humanity's obligation to raise the sparks to repair the universe. So in a way, this show I see at the Jewish Museum is like the repair of his career, the tikkun of Chareau. So, thank you.
Alex, I think we should just give a credit and a real hats off to Diller and Scofidio downstairs
Yes.
for this this absolutely remarkable installation that they created. And what's interesting there too is that they're the perfect group or the perfect pair of architects and studio to be asked to do this because of their own history with mechanics and activation.
Yes, that's
And,
right.
you know, they went back to a group called the Builders Association that Marianne Weems created, which is a performance group. And so that notion of the performative has always been part of their work, and many times very crudely, but downstairs. I mean, again, we look at this as a collaboration now. Now it's a collaboration between the museum, Diller and Scofidio, and Chareau, and using contemporary, you know, state-of-the-art technology to bring that to life, I felt was remarkable.
Yeah, I especially liked the virtual reality glasses. So you could see the furniture, and then when you wear the glasses, you could see it in its original setting, and then actually look around. So, in fact, in a way, it's a work in progress because eventually you'll be able to re-experience walking through it without even these appendages, I would say. And I also like the manner in which this kind of CAT scan machine takes sections through the house, which does enable you to understand it to some degree. But actually, even here, though, I think, again, the house is so difficult to really represent that I think, I think it's impossible without having a series of fragments that somehow in your mind you can put it together.
You know, you had indicated that you were to the house twice, and in preparation for this, several weeks ago, I went to see the Maison de Verre, and I was likening it before to Matisse going to Morocco to paint authenticity, but Morocco had already been a colony of France for quite a while and a tourist destination, and that in a way there were comments that his paintings looked like postcards, you know, that it really, like, it was very hard to disconnect the actual experience of being present there from all of these representations that we had seen before of Morocco. And so it was a difficult experience, and I've had this many times in my life. For instance, when I went down to Sydney and Francis Lewis's home in Richmond, Virginia, where they had an expansive collection of Art Deco. And each one of these pieces, we see them on a page repeated endlessly in magazines and in books and in journals. So you have a sense that this small domestic item is much larger. It's a much larger experience. And they were designed to be domestic, but when I saw them, for instance, in their home, they sort of turned into tiny little pieces that, like, this is what history is. It breaks down.
Really? Oh, you felt the house was smaller? Had you seen it before?
Well,
this was your first time.
I happened into the courtyard like you did. And because it loomed so great in my mind. No, I'm first talking about Sydney and Francis Lewis. This loomed so strong in my mind that when we walked by the courtyard a couple of years ago, it was, I was both in awe of it and surprised by the scale of it. Because as you say, the upper stories recede.
Well, actually, I think it appears smaller from the outside than the inside.
That's right.
I think when you're inside, it's somehow, in fact, it's still surprising. I always feel it's twice as large when you're inside than it shrinks again when you're outside.
Yes.
So it has a very strange kind of an accordion-like effect, which is very different from, like, I think falling water is actually more impressive at some level in the photographs than in walking through it. I don't know.
I found it very hard to be present while I was there. And that's not a criticism of the space or the place, because there was so much anticipation, and perhaps there was so much anticipation for me that I couldn't be removed from it. So, you know, there were a series of anecdotes, and the idea that Pierre Chareau was so intimately involved with his clients and their lives that this house is really not only a reflection of his way of thinking and the fervor that existed at that point in time in terms of moving towards a modernist period, but also in terms of the very particular needs of the household. And you referred to those 3 bells.
Right.
And the interesting element there is, as I learned on this visit, that because they were, I don't know if they were active, the d'Alsace family were actively members, although they were, you know, members of the bourgeois, but they were also very interested or could have been members of the Communist Party. And so that, not to make it sound so strange, but they believed that there should be only the proletariat, and that whether you were a servant or a delivery person or a guest or a patient, that you would enter through the same entrance, and that there was no distinction.
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, there is a service wing, but...
There is, but you enter through the same
actually,
front
he
door.
was apparently a great promoter of women's rights. So he was a gynecologist in the 30s, in the 20s and 30s, actually. But when he returned to France, he was very much behind parenthood and things like that. But also, I mean, as Frampton talks about, there's this strange male-female aspect to the house, and he compares it, in fact, to Duchamp's large glass, in which there's or also called the bride stripped bare by the bachelors, and he talks about Duchamp and glass and the male and female, and so you have the gynecologist on the lower level and then the private quarters above. And so whose domain is the domain of the male and the female and vice versa. So it's, I mean, the house has very many layers of meaning and contradiction in a way.
You know,
I did not see a mezuzah on the house, though.
Well, were they Jewish? I don't
Actually,
know that
well, the d'Alsaces were Jewish.
Was
Oh,
it?
they were definitely Jewish.
Okay.
So that's something I would ask Esther da Costa Meyer about.
Okay. Just going back to women's rights, my understanding was that he was performing abortions. And it was in a period of time where I don't know that abortion was illegal, but it was a period of time that France was looking to build up toward the war movement. And so that this notion of Planned Parenthood was looked down upon or frowned down upon by France as it was moving towards World War II. But as you said, he very, very much believed in this notion of women's rights. So as I walked through the house, and it was kind of interesting, and the first element was that you do enter the surgery. And again, I tend to be myopic. You see, I'm a single piece of furniture is like a universe to me, and I can get lost there. Your way of thinking is probably much larger and much more spatial.
Well, it is missing its furniture, which I thought is something that takes away from the house. I mean, all the photographs are, in fact, every photograph you see are the original ones that has the Chareau furniture, except for the dining table and chairs that were not. But there's something, and there were books in the bookcases, and now it's really empty, and it has a certain coldness now, I think, that it didn't have when it was furnished with Chareau's work.
Well, it was very rich. It had a life, and it was very much about a family.
Right.
And again, going back to that notion about gathered about any given family with the instruments of its pleasures. And the house at this point really is absent of that. So I guess what happened is, as I came upon an object, and again, I have to say, I went there with such tremendous expectation that what does scale mean in terms of how large it looms in your life emotionally, and then to come to this house and it truly is human scale. And even though for some reason I couldn't feel at the moment, it was about looking to have so much feeling connected with the experience, and then I couldn't feel. And so I decided that I would look at it more anecdotally. And it came back to that shock of going directly into the surgery and looking at the examination table, and this idea of what an examination table would have been like at the turn of the 20th century as this machine, and kind of the coldness, and yet everything that the Dalsance family was looking to do was to build a sense of warmth and inclusion and humanity in the space. But there are certain objects that just suddenly leap out of the space. And
well, you were supposed to make a left turn, not go straight. That's why. If you go left, well, you go past the perforated screen behind which is the stair, and they should have opened that and invited you upstairs first. But
well,
if you continue, then you go into the surgical ward, which is not as welcoming, I would say.
Well, mine was
a little like going to a dentist, but maybe not.
Well, not quite a dentist, but yeah. I would say that my tour was the clinical tour.
Yes. Now, if it was a urologist office, maybe you'd feel more at home. I don't know.
No, there I would hightail.
Sorry,
I would hightail out of that one. But again, this notion of integration in the house between what was done professionally and then the sense of remove as you go from.
Why don't we also talk about the idea of the interior designer or furniture designer versus the architect? Because I think that is always an issue, at least as an architect, because the wrong interior designer can ruin a project in my mind. So, and yet I think as someone who's a master of design, you approach it from the other direction. Do you ever see your furniture compromised by the wrong setting for it? Or do you feel your work implies a certain architectural setting that will enhance it as opposed to detract from it?
It depends how engaged I am with the project. Like Eileen Gray and like Pierre Chareau and Eugene Prince, they had stores or showrooms. And so in so many cases, I can't control what happens. Some of the engagement is impersonal engagement, although I do have some wonderful patrons here tonight, Jim and Paula Gould from Boston, who it's a very real pleasure to see you. And from the images I've seen of your home, my pieces are very well placed there. But there are times where I have to disassociate. When I do become involved is on the rare occasions that I'm asked to design the entire interior. And I think I look at the space as if it's like one entire piece of furniture.
Interesting.
And that where the features
You're
of it...
truly an ébéniste.
Yes.
As opposed to an ensemblière.
That could be very true, whatever that means. So. No, I know the ébéniste part.
I don't know. Things I've heard. I think, yeah.
I moved in two directions. One is towards that universal object like the library chair. But like Chareau, Chareau was highly intellectual and really enjoyed these interpersonal relationships, whereas Le Corbusier really wanted a very large public. And I believe that his furniture, the furniture that was designed, was taken into, it was really subservient to the spaces or his view of public space.
Well, one thing, Chareau never really entered the modern world of standardization and mass production, which was always the dream of Corbusier or Marcel Breuer. And in fact, they looked to the Thonet and those chairs that were mass produced as, and yet they were personal, but they also had a kind of universal, almost neutral quality to them. So Chareau's work were basically all custom-made and one-off pieces, as far as I know. Whereas you really dwell in both worlds. You have many custom works, and also you have production items.
And for me, the most interesting production item is the piano, and
yes.
Lucas and my engagement in the piano with Steinway. I look at it as a machine, or we look at it as a machine, and then there's the aesthetic elements, and then how do they integrate in terms of the actual performance of the piano, and then what is that overall experience. But just going back to Chareau in that respect, I feel that he saw that he was in certain ways left behind. I mean, his most important work really ended in 1931, and largely because of the Depression, and then also people fleeing the Nazis. But it raised another question, and you know, it's not entirely in the way that you phrased it, but and maybe it's the difference because these furniture designers were Jewish and the architects weren't Jewish at the time, but the furniture designers who fled to the States never flourished here.
That's right. Did Jean-Michel Franck come here also?
Jean-Michel Franck came here,
Yes,
and he
that's
committed
right.
suicide.
Well, need me say
and
more?
Sadly enough, I mentioned that before, that I was born in 1949, and Chareau was born in 1950, and we want to look at it mystically. We shared this 1 year together. And I was born August 24th, 1949, and he committed suicide August 24th, 1950. And so...
Wait, so you could be the spirit of Jean-Michel Franck? Oh my God!
No, not Jean-Michel Franck.
I mean, of Chareau.
But,
you need a medium. I'm sorry.
But it concerned me in a way, and you know, now we move off of that topic to a degree. That here we have the architect and the furniture designer, and we go into the rather sensitive and myopic life of the furniture designer, where the connection is to this object, and the object itself being a universe, or as Chareau said, each piece aspires to be architecture. He might have gotten that from Le Corbusier because there was an overlap. And it's a very enclosed world. And so the furniture designers and a number of others who came here, we'd have to look at the fact that they were Jewish, that they were escaping, that others in their families may not have escaped, and what levels of feeling that they might have had about that displacement, guilt connected to it. But the inability to find their footing here in this country to build successful careers. Whereas the architects who came here during the same period,
well, Royer
and Gropius and Mies van der Rohe, they became the head of major institutions.
Yes, yes.
And you know, I wonder, do you think that's more the nature of architecture in some way that?
Well, in many, I think it's what you said. Architecture is less. Furniture is the most intimate of designs, whereas it has to conform or relate directly to the human body. Now, architecture always talks about that, but most of the time it doesn't. So only the greatest architects, I think, imply the body and its scale in what they do. And so, on the other hand, there's still a tremendous amount of work that needs to be built. And so there is perhaps more opportunity, or there was, for those architects who came during the war. But I think it's an interesting question. I don't know.
Well, it drove me in a way, because being a furniture maker, I worried about it. I worry about everything. And I saw a lot of parallels between myself and Chareau, and Eugene Prince, and Dunant, and Jean-Michel Franck, and Louis Sogneau, and Sue Mayer, and that all of these people had disappeared. They had literally disappeared because there was no work for them. And also, I thought about this is a young man thinking about this notion of ego and the power in the ego of the architect, and these poor, depressed furniture designers sort of disappearing, that I decided I wanted to be an industrialist. You know,
well, I think your move into production work was very smart. So.
And I think in a certain way it saved me. Now, you're in an interesting position because you work on public projects, you work on urban design, you've done a series of you've done a school, I believe, a school in the Bronx, and then you've done a series of housing projects. And yet you have a good number of residential and domestic architecture that you do. And is that what is your feeling or sense of the relationship to the clients? Is it?
Well, I
how
mean,
do
the
you see
residential is very, well, actually, all of the projects are very much connected to the client, even at the largest scale. We're renovating Bell Laboratories, which is the original Eero Saarinen building, but there is one client who is very personally involved in it, and I need to relate to him the same as I would for a house, in a way. But I consciously expanded the practice so that I would have a range of things, and also to have a social aspect to it. So it's not only working on homes for the wealthy, but to help, do affordable housing as well. One thing I have not done really, or have not pursued, is furniture design. I mean, certain architects do that. However, I did design, the one piece of furniture I did design, I should have showed it, is a piano. And it was a competition for the piano of the 21st century in 2002, and it was a Dutch competition, and so I did a piano based on De Stijl language. So it almost looks like a piano designed by Mondrian.
Alex,
in fact, this is the 100th anniversary of De Stijl, which was from 1917. And it turns out it might be performed at the Stedelijk Museum later this year. But
you have a wonderful sense of humor, and I looked at that piano and thought, it has a wonderful sense of humor.
yes. Well, it only plays De Stijl music, so whatever that is.
So, do we...
Unfortunately, I have it on my iPhone. I could pass that around. I didn't know how to work it into this talk, so I thought I would just do a purist talk on Chareau. So,
as I've gone quite far into my career, we do on occasion, I guess you would call it interior design, interior architecture. But I have wanted to, and I become very engaged in it. But I still keep returning to the single object, and that object as being a universe. That the library chair and a few other items that we've produced like that are truly industrial objects, are now in, that library chair is in about 100 libraries around the world. And so this idea, which brings it to the next point, the breakdown or the relationship between the highly personal and the public. That for me, it comes down to a chair. That this chair is part of a landscape within the library, and yet there's an individual interaction with that chair. Each individual does have that. Whether he considers it or not, it actually is there and it exists. In doing a synagogue, which you well know, I mean, there's the collective and the individual. There's the notion of the community and the single individual who goes to pray. And have you thought about that?
I was just looking at that empty chair, and I was saying a chair also implies the human presence. And I think also architecture, when it's done correctly, also implies the presence of people. Usually, again, that's to me the most difficult thing to kind of conjure up the human scale, to have a range of scales in a work, from the individual to the monumental.
Well, that's what's interesting about that Chareau bench in the very beginning, and that was a big departure from any other type of chair that he had done before, that it's just that curve. It's understanding that very...
that there's weight, that someone's behind is going to sit there.
Right.
Actually, that reminded me of some of your work, that kind of gesture of the human. That
without giving in too far.
As opposed to Frank Lloyd Wright. I mean, I should say not all furniture is related to the human body. I mean, Frank Lloyd Wright was famous for its geometric, and it in fact was part of the kind of fabric of the geometry of the house, whether it was circular, hexagonal, or cube or square. And so he did these chairs that were
Exactly.
really did not, in fact, they discouraged people to sit in. He said sitting is an unnatural position.
Well, I
What do you
think
think of that?
I think, well, we have a 3-hour chair, a 4-hour chair, a 5-hour chair. And when you do a restaurant, you want about an hour and 15
Oh, that's
minute
right.
chair.
For a restaurant, you
gotta-
don't want it to be.
No, 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 you
That's
have to-
why restaurant chairs are not too comfortable.
That's exactly
now
why
I get
restaurant
it.
chairs are not
Oh,
too comfortable.
okay.
But again, what I feel is so brilliant about that is that that bench is relentless in terms of its determination to first be a very, very singular object, and then it does denote the fact that it has a human quality to it. Going back to Frank Lloyd Wright, that interior would not be a Frank Lloyd Wright interior had it not had that furniture in it, but then the furniture is a failure in that respect.
Right.
To, for instance, Johnson Wax.
Right.
Was that truly, it's a very early exploration of the notion of the open floor plan. And in that sense, it's quite interesting.
Yeah,
But
actually, Wright's interiors do not welcome other furniture than his own design. Whereas, I mean, I could see Chareau or Corbusier's interiors accommodating other designs. I mean, it's a shame that the Chareau house right now, I mean, the Maison de Verre does not have a fully furnished interior.
I
But
think I was again.
yeah.
It was something that I did focus on. But yes.
Oh, the other person I thought was interesting was Donald Judd, who is a sculptor, although he did architecture and he did furniture, but the furniture is almost more sculptural than it is furniture. Or is it? Where do you place Donald Judd's furniture?
Well,
is it sculpture or
first,
furniture?
in order to avoid it, I would say it's postmodern, but because nobody knows
You could
what
not
that
like
means.
it. I mean,
No, I mean, it really was very much about sculpture, and I think those furniture pieces maintain a particular aura about them that very much call to mind that this is a Don Judd piece, and that's not what I like them, and I'm an extraordinary admirer and more than an admirer of Don Judd's work, but as furniture on its own, it loses that one factor. Eventually, one is not meant to think about the object, but to become part, that the two become part, like a pas de deux. And that's why I consider, in a way, that to be a furniture designer is like to be a quiet evolutionary rather than this notion of revolutionary, that it's really about becoming part of life.
right.
Beautiful
statement.
Do we
Are we
have
all right? What
any
are we-
questions?
Yeah, which questions?
We have a microphone, so I'll come around if you have a question.
Yeah, we could have done that earlier. What was that?
I don't need a microphone. Oh, okay. I was glad that you brought up the idea of the home or the residence with the furniture and how, Eileen Gray's 1027 house or
I don't
Falling
think that's
Water
on.
or other buildings really feel like a work when they have the furniture that's either been designed for them or designed by the same person as the architect. They have such a special feeling to them. And I don't know if you're aware or just wondering if anyone here is aware if there's any efforts to bring back some of those pieces or replicate them in a way to sort of
At the
evoke.
Maison de Verre?
Yeah, at the Maison de Verre.
I think the present owner wants to live in it in his own way.
So that right. So
in
there's
fact,
no.
he sold all the furniture.
But part of that, it had to do with that much of that furniture was not designed for the Maison de Verre. It came from a previous apartment that the Dalsaces owned.
Right.
And, it's interesting that for someone who was so involved in the moment and that his work was evolving so rapidly in terms of furniture design that he wouldn't have, had the opportunity there to express it. But in that other slide, same thing in that other slide where he did the home of the Fari family, who were the founders of Printemps, the department store in Paris, it was the same thing again, that the furniture just seemed completely out of keeping with the
Actually, it's
architecture.
interesting because he never did the kind of ironwork armature that would support a more comfortable kind of carriage. He did you're right, he never, I mean, I could almost imagine a kind of Chareau-esque extension, you know, design a sofa in this manner of Chareau's, you know, other pieces.
Well,
So,
there was so much about collaboration that with D'Albert, the metal worker, he believed that it was the designer's position, and the architect can say the same there, to depend upon the creativity and the inventiveness of, in that case, the steel worker. In the same way, and we can wonder where is authorship in that case. So I don't think that because that was D'Albert's interest that Chareau moved it in that direction. And a lot of the early pieces, like those wonderful desks that he's known for, were largely Eugene Prince's expertise as well. So, you know, that line between, and then we can look at the Maison de Verre itself, and how do we say his name? Byfoot?
oh yes, actually we never mentioned that it was designed in association with a Dutch architect, Bernard Bayfoot.
Yes,
Whose
Bayfoot.
name I didn't know how to pronounce until yesterday.
Yeah. But he was considered more of an engineer there, and the one who was involved in the structure, because he was a good 20 years younger than Pierre Chareau, or more. He really deferred to Chareau in that way. So, you know, it's hard, and I think that Ken Frampton brought that up as well, to understand where authorship exists in those pieces, and what opportunities he was able to, or ideas he was able to exploit.
I have a question.
Was
that
there-
Did somebody have a question there? Or no? Okay.
The last period you mentioned, what was its name again, and the years? Show the difficult.
Crystal chain.
Crystal.
Well, the first image I showed was Hans Scharoun, and it was a proposal for a city center. Is that the one? I think that's the one. That was like 1920. Yeah.
You said it lasted about 12 years.
Rosalie, German Expressionism. 1914 to when? I don't know. 10 years? I think it was maybe 5 to 10 years, really.
You know, it's interesting to think that Chareau's active career as an independent designer, he had worked for an interior design firm before the war, was only about 11 or 12 years.
Yes.
And so it was really a life cut short,
Yes.
you know. And it would have been very sad. I mean, it would have been really wonderful, and it is very sad that he didn't have the opportunity to continue in the world in a fashion that he could have flourished. But the brilliance is brilliance. I mean, in those very short period of years, really is quite strong. And I guess that's my closing statement. And
Well, thank you both so
Thank
much
you
for
very
this
much.
evening, and thank you all for coming.